most people will never get control over their anger, not because they are weak, not because they are emotional, but because they misunderstand where anger actually comes from. They think anger is something that just happens. They believe it is triggered by people, situations, disrespect, pressure, or bad behavior. But that is the illusion that keeps them trapped in the same cycle for years. Because here is the truth nobody explains clearly enough. Your anger is not the problem. Your reaction to it is. And the moment you finally understand this, something uncomfortable happens. You start realizing that every time you lost control, every time you said something you regretted, every time you entered a pointless argument, it was not the situation that controlled you, it was your response that failed you. And that is where most people get stuck. They keep trying to change the world around them instead of understanding the system within them. But imagine if I told you there are hidden and psychological patterns behind your reactions. Patterns that decide when you get triggered, why you get triggered, and how easily people can pull you into emotional chaos without you even noticing it. And once you see those patterns clearly, you can never go back to being the same person again. Because suddenly, anger stops being automatic. Silence starts becoming powerful. Not everything starts deserving your response. And the battles you used to fight without thinking start disappearing from your life completely. But here is what will shock you the most. By the end of this, you will realize that most of the anger you thought was strength was actually loss of control, and most of the silence you thought was weakness was actually power. And once that truth clicks inside your mind, you will never look at your reactions the same way again. Not everything deserves a reaction, and if you truly understood what that means, your entire emotional life would start to reorganize itself. Because most people are not actually living their lives. They are reacting through them. Every notification, every tone of voice, every facial expression, every slight disagreement becomes a signal that pulls them out of themselves. And the moment you are pulled out of yourself, you are no longer in control of your behavior. You are in a state of response, not choice, not awareness, just reaction. And reaction is dangerous because it feels automatic. It feels justified. It feels like you are defending yourself. But in reality, every unnecessary reaction is a small surrender of your peace. You don't notice it in the moment, but over time it accumulates. You become someone who is easily disturbed, easily engaged, easily pulled into things that don't even matter. Now understand this clearly. There is a difference between responding and reacting. A response is chosen. A reaction is triggered. A response has awareness behind it. A reaction has emotion behind it. And the average person fuses the two, thinking that intensity equals strength. It does not. Intensity without control is instability. So when we say not everything deserves a reaction, we are not talking about ignoring life. We are talking about filtering life. Because if you respond to everything, you become available to everything. And when you are available to everything, you are no longer centered anywhere. Think about how many times your peace has been interrupted by something that did not even matter an hour later. A comment from someone who doesn't even know your full story. A tone that you interpreted as disrespect. A situation that, in the larger picture, had no real impact on your future. Yet in that moment, it felt like everything. That is the illusion of emotional immediacy. It exaggerates importance. It shrinks perspective. And when perspective shrinks, emotions take over. But here is where maturity begins. Maturity is not when you stop feeling things. Maturity is when you stop letting every feeling decide your next move. There is a gap between what happens to you and how you respond to it. Most people never use that gap. They jump immediately from stimulus to reaction. No pause, no filter, no observation, just impulse. And that is why they stay emotionally exhausted. Because every reaction costs energy. Every argument drains something. Every unnecessary explanation takes away a piece of your calm. And the problem is not that life is difficult. The problem is that everything is treated like it deserves attention. When in reality, attention is the most expensive currency you have. Now imagine what changes when you start asking one simple question before reacting. Not after, before. You pause and ask yourself, does this deserve my energy? Not, am I right? Not, should I defend myself? But simply, does this deserve my energy? That question alone creates distance between you and your emotion. And distance is where clarity lives. Because when you are too close to a situation, everything feels personal. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels like it needs to be solved immediately. But when you step back mentally, even for a few seconds, you start seeing patterns instead of moments. You start seeing behavior instead of attack. You start seeing noise instead of meaning. And most of what disturbs you is just noise. There are people who speak not to communicate, but to provoke. There are situations designed not to solve anything, but to pull you into emotional participation. And if you enter every one of those spaces, you are no longer living your life. You are living inside other people's emotional states. That is not strength. That is exposure. The strongest people you will ever observe are not the ones who respond the fastest. They are the ones who delay their reaction long enough for truth to surface. Because truth is quiet. Emotion is loud. And if you let loudness decide your behavior, you will always overreact to things that were never as serious as they felt. So what happens when you stop reacting to everything? At first, people may misunderstand you. They may think you are detached. They may think you are indifferent. But over time, something changes. You become harder to provoke. Not because you are suppressing emotion, but because you are no longer handing control of your emotions to external triggers. And here is the deeper shift. When you stop reacting to everything, you start observing everything. And observation is power. Because observation gives you information without loss of control. You begin to understand people without being pulled into their behavior. You begin to see intentions without being trapped in their energy. And slowly you realize something important. Most things were never meant to be responded to emotionally. They were meant to be understood, filtered, and released. Not every comment is a challenge. Not every tone is disrespect. Not every situation is an attack on your identity. But what? And you react to all of them as if they are. You create unnecessary conflict inside yourself. And that internal conflict is what actually destroys peace, not the external world. So the discipline is simple, but not easy. You learn to delay. You learn to pause. You learn to let things pass through the filter of awareness before they reach your mouth, your actions, or your emotions. And in that pause, you reclaim something most people lose early in life: control. Because once you stop reacting to everything, you stop being controlled by everything. And once you are no longer controlled by everything, you finally start living from a place of choice instead of impulse. And that is where real emotional strength begins, not in louder reactions, not in stronger arguments, but in the quiet decision to stay unchanged by things that do not deserve your energy. Because in the end, your peace was never taken from you. It was always given away, one reaction at a time. People don't create your anger, they reveal it. And that single realization, if you truly allow it to settle in, changes the way you see every conflict for the rest of your life. Because most people believe anger is something that is caused externally. They think someone made them angry. Someone's words, someone's behavior, someone's disrespect. But that language is already the first misunderstanding. No one inserts emotion into you like a switch. What they do is interact with something that is already inside you. They press on a pressure point that already exists. And that is where real self-awareness begins. When you say, "You made me angry," you are giving away ownership of your emotional state. You are handing control of your nervous system to another person's behavior. And the moment you do that, you stop being the observer of your emotions and become controlled by them. But when you shift the language, even slightly, something powerful happens. Instead of "you made me angry," it becomes that situa. Tion triggered anger in me. And now the focus is no longer on blame. It is on awareness. You are no longer pointing outward. You are looking inward. And that shift is uncomfortable for most people because it removes the comfort of blaming others. It forces responsibility back onto you. But that is exactly where your power returns. Because here is the truth that most people avoid. If someone can trigger your anger easily, it means that emotional pattern already exists within you. It might be unresolved frustration. It might be past experiences that were never fully processed. It might be expectations you silently hold about how people should behave. But whatever it is already inside your system. The external world is only revealing it. Think about it like this. A cracked surface does not become visible because someone created the crack in that moment. The crack was already there. The pressure simply exposed it. And human emotions work in the same way. People don't install reactions into you. They expose the reactions you have not yet learned to regulate. So when someone triggers you, the deeper question is not, why are they like this? The deeper question is, why did this affect me this way? That question changes everything, because now you are no longer analyzing other people. You are analyzing your own emotional structure. And that is where growth begins. Most people never reach this stage because it requires honesty without ego protection. It requires you to admit that your emotional reactions are not random. They are patterned, predictable, learnable, and therefore changeable. But if you keep blaming external people, you never enter that process. You stay stuck in repetition. Different faces, same reactions. Different situations, same emotional outcome. And that is not life happening to you. That is a pattern repeating through you. Now understand something very important. This does not mean people are never wrong. It does not mean disrespect is acceptable. It does not mean you ignore harmful behavior. That is not the point. The point is control. The point is ownership of your internal state, regardless of external behavior. Because when you lose that ownership, even justified anger becomes destructive. You may be right in the situation, but still lose yourself in the process. And losing yourself is a far greater cost than being right. So the goal is not to suppress anger. The goal is to understand it. When anger rises, it is signaling something. It is pointing to a boundary that feels crossed, a value that feels challenged, or an expectation that feels violated. But instead of interpreting it as a command to react immediately, you learn to interpret it as information. And information, when understood, does not need to be expressed destructively. Now imagine what changes when you start observing your anger instead of immediately expressing it. You begin to notice patterns. You realize certain people don't make you angry randomly. They activate specific sensitivities in you. You start seeing emotional consistency across different situations. And once you see that pattern, you are no longer controlled by surprise. Because surprise is what fuels emotional reactions. When something feels unexpected, the mind reacts faster than it thinks. But when you recognize patterns, you are no longer surprised. You are prepared. And preparation creates space between feeling and response. That space is where maturity lives. And here is something deeper. The more you take responsibility for your emotional reactions, the less power external situations have over you. Not because they stop happening, but because they stop controlling your identity. You stop thinking, this person ruined my mood. You start thinking, this situation revealed something I need to understand. And that shift slowly transforms your entire emotional system. You become less defensive, not because life becomes easier, but because you become clearer. You stop taking everything personally because you realize most reactions are not about you. They are about patterns, histories, assumptions, and interpretations colliding in real time. And when you understand that, forgiveness becomes easier. Not because people deserve it, but because you no longer carry unnecessary emotional weight. Now, let's go deeper. Every time you feel anger, there is a small gap between the trigger and the explosion. Most people don't notice that gap because it is extremely fast, but it exists. And within that gap is your power. If you rush through it, you lose control. If you recognize it, you regain control. And the entire practice of emotional maturity is learning to extend that gap. Not eliminate emotion, not suppress reaction, but extend awareness. Because awareness is what allows you to choose instead of react. So when someone says something that provokes you, instead of immediately stepping into emotional defense, you learn to pause internally and recognize. This is a trigger, not a command. That recognition alone is powerful enough to change the direction of your response. And over time, something even more interesting happens. Things that used to trigger you stop having the same effect. Not because the world changed, but because your internal sensitivity changed. You are no longer as easily activated. You are no longer emotionally exposed in the same way. And that is when you realize something profound. The goal was never to control other people. The goal was to understand yourself so deeply that other people no longer control your internal state. Because once you understand what triggers you, you stop being controlled by it. And once you stop being controlled by it, you stop being easily disturbed. And once you stop being easily disturbed, you become stable. And stability is the foundation of real emotional strength. So the next time anger rises, don't rush to assign blame. Don't immediately look out. Instead, look inward for understanding. Because what is being revealed in that moment is not someone else's character. It is your own emotional landscape asking to be understood. And when you finally understand it, you stop being a reaction and you become awareness itself. Silence is not weakness, it is regulation. And if you misunderstand silence, you will always think power is about speaking more, defending faster, and reacting immediately. But real control begins where noise ends. Most people underestimate silence because they confuse it with absence. They think if you are not speaking, you are losing. If you are not responding immediately, you are surrendering. If you are quiet in a tense moment, you are being passive. But that interpretation is emotional, not intelligent. Because silence is not the absence of power. It is the control of it. When something triggers you, your mind rushes to fill the space with words. It wants to respond immediately, explain immediately, defend immediately. But that urgency is not wisdom. That urgency is emotional pressure trying to release itself through speech. And if you speak under emotional pressure, you are not communicating. You are discharging emotion. That is the difference most people never learn to recognize. Now think about how many situations in your life escalated not because of what was said to you, but because of how quickly you responded. A moment of disrespect becomes a long argument. A misunderstanding becomes a conflict. A small comment becomes a personal war. Not because the situation demanded it, but because silence was not used as a tool. Silence creates space. And space is where intelligence returns. In that space, something very important happens inside the brain. The emotional spike begins to settle. The immediate reaction loses its intensity. And for a brief moment, logic starts to re-enter the conversation. That moment is critical because it is the difference between reacting from emotional, the ion, and responding from awareness. But most people never stay in that space long enough to benefit from it. They interrupt it. They rush through it. They feel uncomfortable inside it. Because silence forces you to sit with what you feel instead of immediately escaping it through words. And that is exactly why silence feels powerful but uncomfortable at the same time. Because it demands control. Now understand this clearly. Silence is not about avoiding the conversation. It is about entering it in the right state of mind. There is a version of you that speaks from emotion, and there is a version of you that speaks from clarity. Silence is the bridge between the two. When you pause, you are not doing nothing. You are actively preventing emotional distortion from entering your words. You are allowing your response to form after the emotional wave passes, not during it. And that distinction changes everything. Because once something is said in anger, you cannot pull it back, even I. If you apologize, the impact remains. But when you use silence first, you protect yourself from saying things that create long-term consequences for short-term emotions. That is emotional intelligence in practice. Now here is something deeper most people never consider. Silence is not just about controlling what you say to others. It is also about controlling what you say to yourself internally. Because the mind, when triggered, becomes loud. It starts narrating. It starts justifying. It starts building stories in real time. You cannot let this go. You need to respond immediately. They are disrespecting you. You are being treated unfairly. And if you do not pause that internal noise, it will dictate your external behavior. Silence interrupts that internal narrative. It breaks the automatic chain reaction between thought and action. It creates a moment where you can observe your thoughts instead of becoming them. And that is where real strength develops. Because strength is not reacting faster. Strength is interrupting reaction altogether long enough to choose something better. Now imagine what happens when you apply silence in a real conflict. Someone says something sharp, something provocative, something designed to pull you into emotional engagement. The natural instinct is to respond immediately, to defend your position, to correct them, to assert yourself. But instead, you do something different. You pause. You stay quiet for a moment longer than your emotion wants. You allow the discomfort of silence to exist without escaping it. And in that moment, something shifts. You are no longer inside the emotional trap of the situation. You are observing it from a slight distance. And from that distance, you begin to see something clearly. Not every comment deserves a response. Not every insult requires correction. Not every attempt at provocation requires participation. And suddenly, your energy is no longer being spent automatically. It is being allocated consciously. That is regulation. Silence also changes how others perceive you. Because people expect predictable reactions. They expect emotional responses. They expect escalation when they escalate. But when you introduce silence instead, you disrupt their expectation pattern. And when expectations are disrupted, control is lost on the other side, not because you attacked them, but because you did not react in the way they anticipated. That is why silence is powerful in communication. It shifts control from emotional momentum to intentional presence. And here is something even more important. Silence protects your dignity in ways words often cannot. Because when emotions are high, words tend to become excessive. You explain too much. You justify too much. You try too hard to be understood. But over-explaining under emotional pressure often weakens your position, not strengthens it. Silence prevents that overextension. It keeps your words minimal, intentional, and grounded. It ensures that when you do speak, your words carry weight because they are not diluted by emotional excess. Now think about the long-term effect of this practice. The more you use silence as a response tool, the less you find yourself in regretful conversations. The less you feel the need to apologize for things said in heat. The less emotional damage you create in moments of impulsivity. And over time, people begin to recognize something in you. They recognize that you are not easily pulled into chaos, that you do not react instantly, that your presence is steady, not reactive. And that recognition changes how they interact with you. Because people adjust their behavior based on your emotional stability. So silence is not just personal control. It is also relational influence. But the most important shift happens internally. Because every time you choose silence over reaction, you reinforce a new identity within yourself. An identity that does not depend on immediate emotion. Release. An identity that prioritizes clarity over impulse. And that identity becomes stronger with repetition. Until eventually, silence is no longer something you have to force. It becomes your natural response. Not because you are suppressing yourself, but because you are finally in control of yourself. And in that control, you discover something most people never experience. Peace that does not depend on external behavior. Because when you master silence, you are no longer reacting to life as it happens. You are choosing how you exist within it. And that is where true emotional strength begins. Not in louder responses, but in the quiet decision to stay in control when everything inside you wants to react. Most battles are not worth your energy, and if you don't understand this, you will spend your entire life exhausting yourself in situations that were never designed to give anything back to you. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings about emotional strength, the idea that you must engage with everything. That if something is wrong, you must correct it. If something is unfair, you must fight it immediately. If someone provokes you, you must respond with equal intensity. But what people fail to realize is that not every battle is a matter of justice. Sometimes it is just a trap for your attention. And attention is the most expensive resource you have. Once it is spent, it cannot be fully recovered. You can rest your body, but you cannot easily reset your emotional energy if it has been drained through unnecessary conflict. And that is what most people do without realizing it. They spend their emotional energy on battles that have no long-term value, no meaningful outcome, and no real contribution to their life. Now think about your past arguments. Think about the conflicts that consumed your mind for hours, maybe days. At the time, they felt important. At the time, they felt urgent. But if you look at them now, most of them have already lost significance. Some of them you don't even remember clearly. And yet, in that moment, they had full control over your emotional state. That is the illusion of emotional urgency. It makes temporary situations feel permanent. It makes small conflicts feel like identity threats. It makes insignificant words feel like personal attacks that require immediate defense. But maturity begins when you can separate emotional intensity from actual importance, because intensity is not truth. Intensity is just emotional noise. Now here is the deeper question you need to learn to ask yourself in real time, especially in moments of conflict. Not after, not when everything is already over, but in the moment itself. You pause internally and ask, is this worth my energy? And that question sounds simple, but it changes your entire emotional direction. Because most people do not evaluate battles, they enter them automatically. Someone speaks, they respond. Someone provokes, they defend. Someone disagrees, they escalate. There is no filter, no pause, no calculation of cost versus value. And without that filter, you end up fighting everything. But strong people do not fight everything. Strong people choose carefully where their energy goes because they understand something very important. Every unnecessary battle weakens you for the battles that actually matter. And life will always have real battles. Challenges that require clarity. Decisions that require courage. Situations that require firmness. But if you have already exhausted yourself in meaningless conflicts, you will not have the emotional strength left when it actually matters. That is why energy management is more important than emotional expression. Now understand this clearly. Avoiding unnecessary battles is not avoidance of responsibility. It is strategic discipline. It is the ability to recognize that engagement is not always the correct response. Sometimes, non-engagement is the highest form of control. Because when you engage in every conflict, you become emotionally reactive to everything around you. Your stability depends on external behavior. Your peace depends on other people's actions. And that is not stability at all. That is dependency disguised as strength. Real strength is selective engagement. It is the ability to say, "This does not deserve my attention," and actually mean it internally, not just say it externally. Now let's go deeper into what actually happens when you engage in unnecessary battles. First, your emotional energy starts to fragment. Instead of focusing on your life, your goals, your direction, your clarity, your attention gets divided into multiple external conflicts. Second, your emotional baseline begins to shift. You become more reactive over time. Things that used to not bother you start bothering you more easily, because repeated engagement trains your mind to stay in a reactive state. And third, your identity slowly starts to align with conflict. You begin to see yourself as someone who must respond, correct, defend, and argue. And once that identity forms, peace starts feeling unnatural. That is the hidden cost of fighting too many battles. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine a version of you that only engages when it truly matters. A version of you that does not respond immediately, does not get pulled into every disagreement, does not feel obligated to correct every misunderstanding. Instead, you evaluate first. You observe first. You decide consciously whether this situation deserves your energy. That version of you is not weak. That version of you is controlled. And control always looks like stillness from the outside. People may misunderstand it at first. They may think you are ignoring things. They may think you are passive. But over time, they begin to realize something important. You are not reacting less because you are incapable of reacting. You are reacting less because you are no longer willing to waste energy where it has no return. And that creates a shift in how people interact with you. Because when you stop engaging in every emotional pull, people stop trying to pull you into unnecessary conflict as often. They start recognizing that access to your emotional energy is not automatic. It must be earned by relevance, not triggered by impulse. That is a powerful boundary. But the most important change happens within you. Because every time you choose not to engage in an unnecessary battle, you reinforce a deeper internal message. My energy is valuable. And the more you reinforce that message, the more selective you become. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. You begin to see how much of your past emotional exhaustion came from battles that did not deserve your attention in the first place. And slowly, your life becomes quieter internally. Not because there are fewer challenges, but because you are no longer participating in every emotional disturbance that comes your way. Now, understand this final shift. The strongest people are not the ones who fight the most. They are the ones who conserve themselves for what truly matters. They do not waste their energy proving points that have no long-term impact. They do not exhaust themselves in conversations that lead nowhere. They do not enter every emotional invitation they receive. They stay available, but not accessible to everything. And that distinction is everything. Because once you learn to stop fighting unnecessary battles, you stop losing energy to unnecessary people, unnecessary conversations, and unnecessary emotions. And what remains is clarity. And clarity is powerful because it tells you exactly where to stand, when to speak, and when to stay still. So the real question is not whether you can win every battle. The real question is whether that battle was ever worth entering in the first place. Because in the end, your peace is not destroyed by your enemies. It is drained by the battles you never end. You needed to fight. Your reaction is your identity, and most people never realize how much of their life is being defined, not by what happens to them, but by how they consistently respond to what happens. Because every reaction is not just an emotional event, it is a signal. A signal that tells the world what kind of person you are when pressure is applied. It shows what breaks you, what provokes you, what controls you, and what you cannot yet handle internally. And over time, those signals become your reputation. Not your words, not your intentions, your reactions. Now think about that carefully. People don't remember every sentence you said in a heated moment. They remember your emotional pattern under pressure. They remember whether you escalate quickly. They remember whether you stay composed. They remember whether your emotions lead you or whether you lead your emotions. And slowly, without you realizing it, those reactions begin to define how people treat you. Because behavior adjusts to emotional predictability. If someone knows exactly how you will react, they can influence you more easily. They can push your buttons, not because they are powerful, but because your reactions are predictable. And predictability in emotion is vulnerability. Now here is the deeper truth most people avoid. Every time you react impulsively, you are not just responding to a situation. You are reinforcing a version of yourself, a version that is reactive, easily disturbed, emotionally available to triggers, and quick to lose internal balance. And the more you repeat that pattern, the more automatic it becomes. Until eventually, you are no longer choosing your reactions. Your reactions are choosing you. That is why identity is shaped in moments of pressure, not moments of comfort. Because comfort does not reveal who you are. Pressure does. Now understand this clearly. This does not mean you should become emotionless. It does not mean you should suppress your feelings or pretend nothing affects you. That is not strength. That is avoidance. True strength is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of control within emotion. It is the ability to feel something fully without letting it dictate your next action immediately. And that gap between feeling and reaction is where identity is formed. Most people lose that gap. Something happens and they instantly respond. No pause, no evaluation, no awareness, just impulse. And in that impulse, they are no longer acting from choice. They are acting from conditioning. But when you begin to observe your reactions, something powerful happens. You start noticing patterns. You realize that certain situations always trigger the same emotional response in you. Certain tones of voice always activate defensiveness. Certain types of disrespect always create immediate anger. Certain behaviors always pull you into reaction. And once you see the pattern, you are no longer inside it. Because awareness creates distance, and distance creates control. Now imagine what changes when you begin to interrupt that automatic reaction. Someone says something provocative, and instead of immediately reacting, you pause internally. You observe what is happening in your body. You notice the emotional rise. You recognize the urge to respond, but you don't act immediately. And in that moment of pause, something shifts. The intensity begins to reduce. The emotional wave starts to settle. And for the first time, you are not inside the reaction. You are watching it. That is the beginning of emotional mastery. Because mastery is not about never feeling triggered. It is about not being led by the trigger. Now here is something even more important. Your reactions are constantly teaching other people how to treat you. If you react strongly to disrespect, people learn that disrespect controls your emotional state. If you react instantly to provocation, people learn that they can pull you into emotional engagement, meant easily. If you react defensively to every challenge, people learn your boundaries are fragile. But if your reactions are controlled, measured, and intentional, something changes in the environment around you. People begin to adjust their behavior. Not because you demanded it, but because your emotional stability redefines how interaction with you works. That is why reaction is not just personal. It is relational influence. Now think about the cost of uncontrolled reactions. One moment of anger can damage a relationship that took years to build. One impulsive response can create misunderstandings that take long conversations to repair. One emotional outburst can reshape how someone perceives you permanently. And in most cases, the situation that triggered it will not matter a few days later. But the reaction will still carry consequences. That is why emotional control is not about suppressing expression. It is about protecting consequence. Because you cannot control everything. that happens to you, but you can control what you become in response to it. Now let's go deeper into identity itself. Identity is not formed in declarations, it is formed in repetition. Every repeated reaction becomes a reinforcement of who you are. And the more consistent your reactions are, the stronger that identity becomes. So if your reactions are impulsive, your identity becomes impulsive. If your reactions are defensive, your identity becomes defensive. If your reactions are calm and deliberate, your identity becomes stable. You are not just reacting to life. You are building a pattern of self-definition through reaction. And most people never realize they are actively participating in the creation of their own emotional identity every single day. Now imagine deciding to change that pattern, not by forcing yourself to be different, but by becoming aware of every reaction before it happens. By asking internally, is this reaction who I want to be? Not, is this reaction just me, styfied? Not, am I right? But is this reaction aligned with the identity I am building? That question introduces responsibility into emotion. And responsibility changes behavior. Because once you start linking reaction to identity, you stop reacting automatically. You start choosing. And choice is the foundation of transformation. Over time, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Situations that used to pull you into emotional chaos no longer have the same effect. Not because they changed, but because you changed the way you respond to them. You become slower to react. Not slower because you are uncertain, but slower because you are aware. And that awareness creates emotional space. And that space protects your identity from being hijacked by temporary emotion. And eventually, people begin to see you differently. They notice your stability. They notice your restraint. They notice that you do not react in predictable emotional patterns anymore. And that unpredictably. The idea of reaction is what creates emotional strength. Because now, people cannot control your state through simple triggers. Now here is the final realization. Your reaction is the only part of any situation that fully belongs to you. Everything else is external. The words of others, their behavior, their tone, their choices, their actions. All of that belongs to them, but your reaction belongs to you. And whatever you consistently do with what belongs to you becomes who you are. So the real question is not what people are doing to you. The real question is who you are becoming because of how you are reacting to it. Because in the end, your identity is not built in calm moments. It is built in how you respond when everything inside you wants to lose control. And if you can master that moment, you are no longer defined by reactions. You are defined by awareness.